72 hours. That's all we had before we lost our home, but my daughter found salvation in the one place I'd forbidden her to go, the Iron Hounds clubhouse. The notice was taped to our door with an aggressive amount of packing tape, as if the landlord, Mr. Henderson, was worried a strong gust of wind might blow away our ruin. It was a stark, ugly piece of paper, the words "Final Notice to Vacate" stamped in blood-red ink at the top. 72 hours. That's all we had. 3 days to pack up a life, to find a new home, and to somehow explain to my 7-year-old daughter, Chloe, why we had to leave the only home she'd ever known. My stomach felt like it was full of cold, wet cement. I'd been working 2 jobs, cleaning offices at night, and waitressing on weekends just to keep our heads above water. But one unexpected car repair, 1 week of the flu, and the whole fragile structure came crashing down. I was 2 months behind on rent, and Mr. Henderson, a man who measured his compassion in dollars and cents, had finally run out of patience. "Mummy, what's that paper?" Chloe asked, pointing a small finger at the notice I'd just ripped from the door. She had her sketchbook tucked under her other arm, her constant companion. 2 puffs of dark hair, tied up with bright pink ribbons, bounced as she tilted her head. Her eyes, big and brown, and full of a universe of trust, were fixed on my face, waiting for an answer I didn't have. It's a note from Mr. Henderson, sweetie," I said, my voice thin. I tried to fold the paper, to hide the angry red letters from her. "He says we might be moving to a new house soon. Won't that be an adventure?" Chloe's brow furrowed. She was a smart kid, an old soul in a tiny body. She could read my face better than she could read the chapter books I brought home from the library. She knew an adventure from an emergency. "But I like this house," she said softly. "All my drawings are on the fridge here." My heart cracked right down the middle. I spent the next day on the phone, a frantic, buzzing mess of desperation. I called family, but they had their own struggles. I called social services, but the waiting lists were miles long. I even swallowed my pride and called Mr. Henderson again, begging for an extension, for a payment plan, for anything. "The decision is final, Maria," he'd said, his voice as cold and flat as a dial tone. "I'm running a business, not a charity. You have until Friday at noon. The sheriff will be there to escort you out if your things aren't gone." He hung up before I could even start crying. The weight of it all was crushing. I felt like a failure as a provider, as a protector, as a mother. That evening, as I sat at our small kitchen table with my head in my hands, Chloe came and wrapped her little arms around my neck. "Don't be sad, Mommy," she whispered into my hair. "We can ask the big men for help." I lifted my head, confused. "What big men, sweetie?" She pointed out the window down the street. "The men with the noisy bikes, they look really strong. I bet they could tell Mr. Henderson to be nice." My blood ran cold. She was talking about the Iron Hounds, the motorcycle club, whose clubhouse was just 2 blocks away. They were the neighborhood legends, a constant rumbling presence, a group of massive bearded men who wore leather vests covered in menacing patches. They kept to themselves, but their reputation preceded them. I'd always pull Chloe a little closer, quickening my pace whenever we had to walk past their building, the low, guttural rumble of their bikes feeling like a warning. They were the last people on earth I would ever ask for help. "No, baby, we don't bother those men," I said, my voice sharp with fear. They're very busy. We'll figure this out ourselves." I thought that was the end of it. I tucked her into bed, read her a story, and then collapsed onto the couch. The exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical illness. I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, the pale light of dawn was filtering through the blinds. The apartment was silent. Too silent. A knot of pure dread tightened in my gut. "Chloe?" I called out, my voice hoarse. No answer. I scrambled off the couch and ran to her room. Her bed was empty, the covers thrown back. My eyes darted around the room, landing on the window. It was pushed open, just a few inches, a space just big enough for a determined 7-year-old to slip through. On her pillow she'd left a piece of paper. It wasn't a note, not with words. It was a drawing. On one side of the paper she had drawn our little apartment with a big sad face over the door, and stick figures of me and her crying. On the other side she had drawn a group of very large men with beards and big motorcycles. They all had smiley faces, and my tiny stick figure Chloe was standing in front of them, holding up a sign that said, in her shaky first-grade print, "Please help." My heart stopped. I knew exactly where she had gone. I flew out of the apartment, not even bothering to put on shoes. I ran down the block, my bare feet slapping against the cold pavement. As I got closer to the Iron Hounds clubhouse, a hulking, windowless brick building, I could hear the low murmur of voices and the clink of glass. The heavy front door was propped open. I skidded to a halt in front of it, my chest heaving, my mind screaming. And there, in the dim light of the clubhouse, surrounded by a semicircle of giants clad in leather and denim, stood my tiny daughter. Her little chin was lifted, her shoulders set with a determination I'd never seen before, and in her hands, held up for them all to see, was another drawing of our sad little house, a single tear rolling down its cartoon window. For a second that stretched into an eternity, nobody moved. The air in the clubhouse was thick with the smell of stale beer, old leather, and engine oil. The men surrounding my daughter were a gallery of nightmares from a parent's handbook. Tattoos snaked up their necks and disappeared into their beards. Silver skulls glinted on their fingers, and their leather vests were adorned with patches that read Enforcer and Road Captain. They weren't just big. They were monuments of intimidation. And my 7-year-old daughter stood in the center of them all, completely unafraid. Then every head swiveled towards me, standing breathless and shoeless in the doorway. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Chloe," I gasped, stumbling forward. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." She slipped out. "I didn't know. Please, we'll go. We won't bother you again." I reached for Chloe's hand, my own trembling so badly I could barely form a grip. "Hold on, Mama." The voice was a low rumble, like gravel rolling downhill. It came from the biggest of them all, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of a mountain. He had a thick, gray-streaked beard and a bald head that gleamed in the dim light. He took a step forward and I instinctively pulled Chloe behind me, shielding her with my body. The man stopped, holding up his huge, calloused hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy now. No one's in trouble." He knelt down, a difficult process for a man his size, until his eyes were almost level with Chloe's. "Your little girl was just telling us a story." Chloe peeked out from behind my legs. Her fearlessness returned in a flash. "I was showing them my drawing," she said, her voice clear and bright in the tense silence. "I told them Mr. Henderson is a mean man, and he's making our house sad, and he's making you cry, Mommy." The mountain of a man looked from Chloe to me, his expression unreadable. "That right?" he asked, his voice softer now. "This Mr. Henderson, he's your landlord?" I could only nod, my throat tight with a mixture of fear and shame. I felt the eyes of every man in that room on me, dissecting my failure. I was a single mother who couldn't even pay her rent, now trespassing in a biker clubhouse before the sun was even fully up. I lost some hours at work," I stammered, the words spilling out in a desperate rush. "My car broke down. I got behind, and he won't give me any more time. We have until Friday, at noon." The big man's jaw tightened. A muscle flexed under his skin. He looked at the crumpled eviction notice still clutched in my hand. "Can I see that?" he asked. It wasn't a question. Hesitantly, I handed it over. He took the paper from me, his massive fingers surprisingly gentle. He stood up to his full, terrifying height, and read it, his eyes scanning the page. The clubhouse was dead silent. The only sound was the crinkle of the paper in his hand. He read it once, then read it again. The atmosphere in the room changed. It was subtle, but it was there. The casual lounging turned into stillness. The lazy morning vibe evaporated, replaced by something heavy and focused. It felt less like a bar and more like a war room. He finished reading, and slowly, deliberately, folded the paper back along its original creases. He looked around the room, his gaze passing over each member of his club. They watched him, waiting. Finally, his eyes landed back on me. "Walter Henderson," he said, reading the name at the bottom of the notice. His voice was flat, cold steel. "Friday at noon." He let the words hang in the air for a moment before handing the notice back to me. His eyes, the color of dark coffee, locked onto mine, and for the first time I saw something other than intimidation in them. I saw a flicker of cold, controlled fury. "That's not going to happen," he stated. Not as a promise, but as a simple declaration of fact. He turned his head slightly, addressing a wiry man with a long scar down his cheek who stood by the bar. "Tank, get Roach and Cutter. We're going for a ride." He looked back at me, and his next words made the air leave my lungs in a whoosh. "We need to have a talk with Mr. Henderson." Then he knelt down again in front of Chloe, who was staring up at him with wide, adoring eyes. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "But first, I think this little artist deserves some breakfast. You like pancakes, little bird?" He looked at me, his expression softening almost imperceptibly as he watched my terrified, confused face. "Don't you worry, Maria," he said, somehow knowing my name. "You're not losing your home." He stood up and gestured toward the door. "But you and Chloe are coming with us. We're all going to pay your landlord a little visit. Together." My brain short-circuited. I stared at him, my mouth opening and closing like a fish. Go with them? To see Mr. Henderson? The image that flashed through my mind was terrifying. A dozen leather-clad giants roaring up to my landlord's pristine suburban home, with me and my 7-year-old daughter in tow. It was insane. It was dangerous. It was also the only lifeline I'd been thrown in months. I can't," I stammered, shaking my head. "I can't ask you to do that. It's my problem. I'll figure something out." The big man, who I now knew, was the club's president, just by the way the others deferred to him, let out a short, humorless laugh. "Sweetheart, you didn't ask. Your little girl did, and around here, that carries a lot of weight." He looked down at Chloe, who was beaming. "Besides, we're not doing anything. We're just going to have a conversation. A community outreach initiative, you could call it." The corner of his mouth twitched, and a few of the other men chuckled darkly. The one called Tank clapped a man with a wild red beard on the shoulder. "You hear that, Cutter? We're doing community outreach." Before I could protest further, a woman emerged from a back room. She was older, with sharp, intelligent eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight braid. She wiped her hands on a dish towel tucked into her jeans. "Pancho, what's all the racket?" she asked, her voice carrying an authority that even the president seemed to respect. Then she saw me and Chloe huddled by the door. Her expression softened instantly. "Well now, what have we here?" she said, her eyes twinkling as she looked at Chloe. "This is Maria and her daughter Chloe," Pancho said. "Elena, this is the artist I was telling you about." He winked at Chloe. "Elena makes the best pancakes in the state. Go on, little bird. Go see Elena. Your mom and I need to talk for a minute." Chloe, ever trusting, took one look at the kind-faced woman and immediately let go of my leg, marching over to her with her sketchbook held out. Elena knelt down, admiring the drawing of the sad house, tutting sympathetically. As she led Chloe toward a small kitchen area tucked in the back, I felt a new wave of panic. I was alone with them. Pancho's gaze turned serious again. "Look, Maria, I know what you're thinking. We're big, we're loud, and we don't look like the PTA. But we've been in this neighborhood a long time. Longer than that slumlord Henderson, that's for sure. We take care of our own. And this little girl," he nodded towards the kitchen, where I could hear Chloe chattering away to Elena. "She came to us. That makes you and her part of our own." He explained the plan, if you could call it that. It was alarmingly simple. They would escort me and Chloe to Mr. Henderson's office. I wouldn't have to say a word. I would just be there, with Chloe. Pancho and 2 of his men, Tank and Cutter, would do the talking. "It's a negotiation," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Just a friendly chat about tenant rights and neighborly responsibilities." Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself nodding. What other choice did I have? I was out of options, out of time, and out of hope. These terrifying, leather-clad angels of chaos were my only chance. An hour later, I was sitting in the back of a surprisingly clean black SUV, with Chloe buckled in beside me, happily munching on a chocolate chip pancake Eleanor had wrapped in a napkin for her. In front of us, Pancho was driving, with Tank in the passenger seat. Behind us, the deep, guttural rumble of at least 10 motorcycles was a constant vibrating presence. They weren't riding in a pack. They were an escort. A rolling barricade of chrome and steel. People on the sidewalk stopped and stared as our procession moved through the morning traffic. I felt like I was in a bizarre dream. We pulled up to a small, neat brick building in a much nicer part of town. Henderson Properties. The sign read in tasteful gold letters. My stomach twisted into a painful knot. I had only ever spoken to Mr. Henderson on the phone or received his curt typed notices. I'd never had the courage to face him here, in his sterile professional domain. Pancho put the SUV in park and turned to look at me. "You ready?" I shook my head, my throat dry. "No." He gave me a surprisingly gentle look. "All you have to do is stand there. Let us handle it." He looked at Chloe. "You ready, little bird? Time to go talk to Mr. Henderson." Chloe nodded, her face smeared with chocolate, completely oblivious to the tension radiating off of me. The bikers behind us cut their engines, and the sudden silence was more intimidating than the noise had been. They dismounted in unison, their boots hitting the pavement with a series of heavy thuds. They didn't come forward. They just stood by their bikes, lining the street. A silent, watchful army. Pancho, Tank, and Cutter got out of the SUV. I took a deep breath, unbuckled Chloe, and followed them, holding my daughter's hand in a death grip. We walked up the manicured path to the glass front door. Through it, I could see Mr. Henderson sitting at his desk, talking on the phone. He looked up, annoyed by the shadows falling over his doorway. His expression shifted from irritation to confusion, and then to outright alarm, as he took in the sight of 3 enormous bikers and a disheveled single mother standing on his doorstep. Pancho didn't bother with the handle. He just pushed the door open, the little bell above it giving a pathetic, tinkling jingle that was completely at odds with our entrance. Mr. Henderson scrambled to his feet, dropping the phone back into its cradle. "What is the meaning of this? Who are you people? This is private property," he sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. Pancho ignored him completely. He walked calmly to the chair in front of the desk and gestured for me to sit. Numbly, I did, pulling Chloe onto my lap. Pancho then turned to face Mr. Henderson, planting his hands on the polished surface of the desk and leaning forward, his sheer size seeming to shrink the entire office. "Walter," Pancho said, his voice a low, calm growl, "we're here to talk about Maria's lease." Mr. Henderson puffed out his chest, a cornered man trying to project an authority he no longer possessed. "Her lease is terminated. She's 2 months behind. It's a simple matter of contract law. Now I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call the police." Pancho didn't even blink. He just smiled, a slow, cold curving of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. "The police? Good idea. Let's call them. We can have a nice long chat. I'm sure they'd be very interested in the building code violations down at 1420 Oak Street, faulty wiring in the hallway, the persistent black mold in the basement that you keep painting over, the broken lock on the main entry door that you've ignored for 6 months despite multiple tenant complaints." He straightened up, his smile vanishing. "We could talk about that, or we could talk about Maria's lease." Mr. Henderson's face went from blotchy red to a pasty white. He looked at me, then back at Pancho, his Adam's apple bobbing. He knew. He knew he'd been cutting corners for years, banking on the fact that his tenants were too poor or too scared to fight back. This is extortion," he stammered. "No," Pancho corrected him, his voice dangerously soft. "This is a negotiation. You see, we, the Iron Hounds, have decided to take a more active role in our community, and we've identified 1420 Oak as a building of significant interest. We're considering it a community landmark, and we don't like it when people mistreat our landmarks." Tank and Cutter, who had been standing silently by the door like twin statues of doom, both took a half-step forward in perfect sync. It was a tiny movement, but the implied threat was deafening. Mr. Henderson flinched as if he'd been struck. Pancho leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "So here's the new contract. Maria stays. Her back rent is forgiven. Call it a community investment on your part. In exchange for her continued tenancy, you're going to fix the wiring. You're going to have the mold professionally remediated. You are going to install a new, high-security lock on the front door. And you're not going to raise her rent for the next 2 years. In exchange for all that, we won't feel the need to share our concerns about your business practices with the City Housing Authority. He picked up a pen from Mr. Henderson's desk and rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. Seems fair to me. What do you think, Walter? For a long moment the only sound was the ticking of a clock on the wall. Mr. Henderson stared at Pancho, then his gaze flickered to me, then to the silent army of bikers visible through his large front window. Defeated, he sagged into his chair and reached for a piece of paper. His hands were shaking as he began to write. He wrote out a simple agreement, his fancy cursive now a desperate scrawl. He dated it, signed it, and pushed it across the desk without a word. Pancho picked it up, read it carefully, and nodded. "Pleasure doing business with you, Walter." He handed the paper to me. It felt like the heaviest, most precious thing I had ever held. We walked out of that office and back into the bright morning sun. The bikers who had been standing guard all straightened up as Pancho emerged. He gave them a single, curt nod. The tension broke. The deep rumble of engines started up one by one, a triumphant chorus. Pancho walked us back to the SUV. Before I got in, I turned to him, the piece of paper clutched in my hand. Words felt so small, so inadequate. I don't know how to thank you," I whispered, tears finally blurring my vision. He just shrugged his massive shoulders. "Your kid drew us a picture. We owed her a favor." He looked down at Chloe, who was holding her own drawing next to the new agreement, as if comparing them. He knelt down in front of her. "You keep drawing, little bird," he said gruffly. "You got a gift." He reached into his vest and pulled off a small circular patch. It was the Iron Hound's insignia, a snarling dog's head. He pressed it into her small hand. "You ever need us again, you just show this to one of us. We'll come running." Chloe's eyes were wide as saucers. She looked at the patch, then up at the giant of a man, and then she did something that stunned us all. She launched herself forward and wrapped her little arms around his thick neck in a fierce hug. For a moment Pancho froze, completely rigid. Then, slowly, awkwardly, one of his huge, tattooed arms came up and gently patted her on the back. That afternoon, a construction van pulled up in front of our building. Men started working on the front door. The next day, a team in hazmat suits went into the basement. Mr. Henderson never looked me in the eye again. He'd scurry away whenever he saw me in the hall. The eviction notice was gone, and in its place on our fridge, right in the center, Chloe taped 2 new pictures. One was the drawing of our house, but now it had a giant, happy smiley face. The other was a crayon portrait of Pancho on his motorcycle, looking less like a scary biker and more like a knight on a chrome steed. Taped carefully beneath it was the Iron Hound's patch. Our home was no longer just a place we lived. It was a place we were protected. I still worked 2 jobs, and life was still hard, but that cold cement in my stomach was gone, replaced by a warmth I hadn't felt in years. We weren't alone anymore. We had family, the strangest, loudest, most wonderful family I could ever have imagined. And every time I heard the distant rumble of a Harley, I didn't pull Chloe closer out of fear. I smiled. It was the sound of our guardian angels riding shotgun for us down the long, uncertain road of life.